Richard Sterling believed that money was the only superpower in New York City. When he handed Charlotte the divorce papers, stripping her of the penthouse, the jewels, and the status, he thought he was sending a lamb out into the wilderness to be eaten. He looked at her silence and saw weakness. He looked at her tears and saw defeat. But Richard made a catastrophic mistake. He didn't realize that for 15 years, Charlotte hadn't been hiding behind his money. She had been protecting him from hers. And when a vintage Rolls-Royce with diplomatic flags pulls up to the curb to pick her up, Richard is about to learn that some names carry more weight than $1 billion. The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry, yet Richard Sterling looked as if he had just shed 50 pounds of dead weight. He sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in the offices of Blackwood and Calloway, his tailored suit absorbing the sterile light of the boardroom. He didn't look at Charlotte. He looked through her, his gaze fixed on the skyline of Manhattan, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a city he believed he owned. "It's done," Richard said, capping his gold Mont Blanc pen with a satisfying click. He slid the documents across the table toward his attorney, Preston Calloway. "The settlement is finalized. The funds will be transferred to whatever account you've set up, Charlotte." Charlotte sat opposite him. She was composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, one she had bought off the rack at a department store the week prior. The diamonds were gone. The platinum bands were gone. Even the light in her eyes seemed dimmed, a dull grey that Richard mistook for defeat. "Thank you, Richard," she said softly. Her voice lacked the tremble he had expected. He had wanted tears. He had wanted begging. "It's a generous amount, considering," Richard said, finally deigning to look at her. His eyes were cold, the color of frozen steel. 500,000. Enough to start over somewhere. Quiet. Ohio, perhaps? Or maybe you can move back in with your sister in Jersey. Preston Calloway cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. Per the prenuptial agreement of 2011, Mr. Sterling retains full ownership of Sterling Global, the properties in East Hampton and Aspen, and the primary residence on Fifth Avenue. Ms. Sterling retains her personal effects and the lump sum mentioned. It was a bloodbath disguised as a legal proceeding. Richard had built Sterling Global on the back of Charlotte's connections, her charm, and her ability to smooth over his abrasive nature with the old money families of the Northeast. But Richard had convinced himself that he was the sun, and she was merely a satellite. He had met a younger woman, a 24-year-old model named Tiffany, with a vacuous laugh and an Instagram following that Richard mistook for social capital. He wanted a clean slate. "I have one request," Charlotte said. The room went silent. Richard smirked. "The artwork. The jewelry, Charlotte, we went over this. You leave with what you came with, which, if I recall, was debt and a liberal arts degree." "The invite," Charlotte said, her voice steady, "to the chaotic charity gala at the Met next month, the foundation ball." Richard laughed. It was a barking, ugly sound. "The foundation ball, Charlotte, tickets are 50,000 a plate. And besides, it's for the inner circle. You're not relevant anymore. You're a civilian now." "My name is still on the committee list," she countered. "Removed this morning," Preston interjected smoothly. "At Mr. Sterling's request. It would be awkward for everyone involved." Charlotte stood up. She picked up her handbag, a worn leather tote, not the Birkin she used to carry. "Very well. I suppose I'll find my own way." Richard stood as well, buttoning his jacket. He walked around the table and leaned in close to her, smelling of expensive scotch and arrogance. "Charlotte, let me give you some advice. Don't try to claw your way back in. You were a guest in this world. The party is over. Go find a nice accountant in the suburbs and fade away. It's the dignified thing to do." He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched out of the room, Preston trailing him like a loyal spaniel. Charlotte stood alone in the boardroom. She walked to the window and looked down at the streets below. Richard thought he had stripped her of her armor. He thought the money was the shield. He didn't realize that the money was actually the leash, and he had just cut her loose. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, antiquated flip phone, a burner she had kept hidden in the lining of her jewelry box for 6 years. She dialed a number from memory. It rang once. "It's done," she said. A deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "Did he sign the waiver on the holding company?" "He signed everything," Charlotte whispered. "He was so desperate to get rid of me, he didn't even read the addendum on page 42. "Then he is dead, and he doesn't even know it," the voice said. "The car will be waiting." Charlotte snapped the phone shut. She didn't smile. Smiling was for the victors, and the war wasn't over yet. This was just the opening shot. She left the building, walking past the receptionist, who used to bring her coffee and now refused to make eye contact. She stepped out into the cold November wind of New York City. She hailed a yellow cab, no longer having access to the company driver. As she sat in the back of the cab smelling of stale smoke and pine air freshener, she watched a black SUV speed past with tinted windows. She knew it was Richard. He was probably on his way to Tiffany to celebrate his freedom. "Enjoy it, Richard," she thought. "Enjoy the silence, because the noise I'm about to make will shatter your windows." 3 weeks later, Charlotte was living in a 4th-floor walk-up in Queens. The paint was peeling, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the view was a brick wall. It was a far cry from the 5th Avenue penthouse with its sweeping views of Central Park, but to Charlotte it felt like a command center. She had spent the last 21 days methodically dismantling her old life and preparing the new one. Richard had been right about one thing: the social exile was swift and brutal. Her phone, her real phone, had stopped ringing the day the divorce was finalized. Friends she had hosted for summers in the Hamptons, women she had supported through their own scandals, the wives of senators and bankers, they all went silent. She was a non-entity. In their world, a divorced woman without a fortune was like a contagion. She went to the grocery store in sweatpants. She took the subway. She saw the tabloids at the newsstand. Richard Sterling's new flame, inside the billionaire's romantic getaway to St. Bart's. There were photos of Richard and Tiffany on a yacht, her yacht, the one she had picked out the teak flooring for. Tiffany was wearing a diamond necklace that looked suspiciously like the one Richard had claimed was lost during the insurance audit last year. Charlotte bought a carton of milk and a copy of the Financial Times. She didn't buy the tabloid. Back in her apartment, the walls were covered not with art, but with flowcharts, post-it notes, timelines. She wasn't just an ex-wife. Before she was Mrs. Sterling, Charlotte had been Charlotte Vanderbilt, not of the famous line, but of a quiet, disinherited branch that had changed their name to vanish from the public eye. Richard knew she came from good stock, but he thought her family was destitute. He didn't know about the trust. He didn't know about the Grand Duchy connection her grandmother had maintained in Europe. But even more than her lineage, Charlotte had something more dangerous. She had been Richard's confidant for 15 years. She knew where the bodies were buried. Specifically, she knew about Project Chimera. Project Chimera was Richard's flagship initiative, a massive urban development project in London that was leveraged to the hilt. He had bet the entire company on it. And to get the permits, he had bribed 3 city councillors and falsified environmental reports. Charlotte had the original reports. She had kept them in a safety deposit box in Zurich since 2019, just in case. But revealing them now would just look like a bitter ex-wife's revenge. She needed to destroy him publicly, socially, and financially. in a way that left her hands clean. The day of the foundation ball arrived. It was raining in New York, a miserable freezing sleet. Richard would be arriving in a limousine. The press would be there. It was the social event of the season. Charlotte stood in her tiny bathroom, applying lipstick in a shade of red so dark it was almost black. She put on a dress she had retrieved from storage. It wasn't a designer gown from the current season. It was a vintage piece, 1930s, silk velvet midnight blue, with a back that plunged dangerously low. It belonged to her grandmother. It reeked of old power, not new money. She had no ticket. She had no invitation. At 7:00 p.m. her buzzer rang. She walked down the 4 flights of stairs, her heels clicking on the linoleum. When she pushed open the heavy front door of the apartment building, the street was transformed. Parked directly in front of the fire hydrant, ignoring the honking horns of angry delivery trucks, was a car that didn't belong in Queens. It didn't even belong in the 21st century. It was a 1958 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud Pristine, painted in a two-toned silver and charcoal. The license plate was diplomatic. Standing by the rear passenger door was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He wore a uniform that was not a standard chauffeur's livery. It was military-grade wool, dark grey with a subtle crest embroidered on the lapel, a crest featuring a double-headed eagle. This was Arthur. Arthur was not a hired driver. Arthur was the head of security for the House of Valois-Bourgogne, one of the oldest, most reclusive banking families in Europe. A family that Richard Sterling had been trying to get a meeting with for 10 years. A family that had rejected him every single time. Arthur saw Charlotte. He didn't look at the peeling paint of the building or the trash on the sidewalk. He snapped his heels together and bowed a deep, respectful bow that he would never have offered to a man like Richard. "Madame," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the noise of the street. "The procession is ready." "Thank you, Arthur," Charlotte said. He opened the door for her. The interior was cream leather and walnut wood. It smelled of lavender and old paper. As she slid into the seat, Arthur handed her a thick cream envelope, sealed with red wax. "From the patriarch," Arthur said. Charlotte broke the seal. Inside was a single card. "The seat at the head of the table is empty. It is time you took it. H." Charlotte looked out the window as the car pulled away, gliding over the potholes as if they didn't exist. They weren't heading to the airport. They were heading straight to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Richard was currently walking the red carpet, Tiffany on his arm, flashing his teeth at the cameras, thinking he was the king of New York. He had no idea that the Queen was coming, and she was bringing the guillotine. The red carpet outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art was less of a walkway and more of a gladiatorial arena. The air was thick with the frenetic energy of flashing bulbs, shouting photographers, and the desperate, cloying scent of ambition. Rain slicked the crimson runner, turning it into a mirror that reflected the distorted egos of New York's elite. Richard Sterling stepped out of his elongated black Mercedes Maybach, the flashbulbs erupting like a strobe light storm. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, a custom Tom Ford, that cost more than the average American car, and turned to offer a hand to Tiffany. Tiffany emerged a vision in electric pink sequins. It was a loud dress, a look-at-me dress. She beamed, waving at cameras that were mostly focused on the A-list actress, standing 10 feet away. Richard placed a proprietary hand on the small of her back, guiding her forward. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was his kingdom. He had shed the dead weight of his marriage. His stock price was up 3 points, and he was walking the Met Gala carpet with a woman 20 years his junior. Richard, over here, is it true Sterling Global is breaking ground in London next month?" a reporter from Bloomberg shouted. Richard paused, flashing his practiced wolfish grin. "London is just the beginning," he quipped, projecting his voice. "We're building the future." He felt a vibration in his pocket. His phone. He ignored it. Probably Preston Calloway updating him on the final transfer of the settlement funds. He wanted Charlotte to see the notification that her paltry exit package had cleared. He wanted her to feel the finality of it. "You look tense, baby," Tiffany whispered, squeezing his arm. Her nails were long, manicured talons. "Just business," Richard muttered, scanning the crowd. He was looking for Alexander Croft, the CEO of Sovereign Bank. Richard needed a bridge loan to cover the cost overruns on Project Chimera, and Croft had been dodging his calls for weeks. He spotted Croft near the entrance talking to a senator. Richard began to steer Tiffany towards them, preparing his pitch, when the atmosphere on the red carpet shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was the sudden absence of it. The aggressive shouting of the paparazzi died down, replaced by a confused murmur. Heads turned. Even the security guards, usually stone-faced, looked unsettled. Richard turned to look back at the curb. Rolling through the blockade of modern limousines and SUVs was a vehicle that looked like it had driven straight out of a history book. It was the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud Charlotte had entered in Queens, but under the harsh lights of the gala, it looked like a weapon. The two-tone silver and charcoal paint absorbed the flashbulbs rather than reflecting them. It moved with a heavy, silent grace, parting the sea of lesser cars. The vehicle didn't stop at the designated drop-off point where the valets were waiting. It rolled past them, ignoring the frantic waving of the event coordinator, and pulled up directly to the base of the stairs, a privilege reserved strictly for heads of state and royalty. "Who is that?" Tiffany asked, popping her gum. "Is it the president?" Richard frowned. "No, the president is in D.C., probably some rented prop for a rapper." The car came to a halt. For a long 10 seconds, nothing happened. The tinted windows remained black. The rain drummed rhythmically on the steel roof. Then the driver's door opened. Arthur stepped out. In the context of the glitzy gala with men in slim-fit tuxedos and velvet slippers, Arthur looked like a cliff face. His grey military-grade wool uniform was immaculate, the silver buttons gleaming dully. He didn't look at the press. He didn't look at the security team rushing toward him to tell him he couldn't park there. He simply walked around the back of the car, his movement precise and fluid. He opened a large black umbrella, holding it high. Then he reached for the rear passenger handle. "Richard, look," Tiffany said, pointing. The flag. Richard squinted. On the front fender of the car, a small, stiff flag had been unfurled. It wasn't a national flag. It was a crest, a double-headed eagle on a field of deep maroon. Richard's stomach dropped. He knew that crest. He had seen it on the letterhead of rejection letters from the Valois-Bourgogne banking dynasty for a decade. Impossible. The rear door swung open. A leg appeared. Not a bare leg in a high slit like Tiffany's. A leg clad in sheer black silk stocking, ending in a black velvet pump with a heel that looked like a dagger. Charlotte Sterling de Charlotte Vanderbilt emerged from the shadows of the car. She stood up, and Arthur instantly positioned the umbrella over her, shielding her from the sleet. The crowd gasped. It was audible. Charlotte was wearing the midnight blue 1930s gown. It draped over her body like liquid metal, modest in the front, with a high neck but devastating in its tailoring. It didn't sparkle with sequins. It absorbed the light, making her skin look like alabaster. Her hair was swept up in a severe, elegant chignon, exposing the long, graceful line of her neck. She wore no necklace, no earrings. Her only accessory was the way she held her head. Is that his ex-wife?" A photographer whispered his voice, caught by a nearby microphone. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He took a step forward, his instinct to control the situation kicking in. "What is she doing here?" he hissed. "She looks old," Tiffany said, though her voice wavered. She looked at her own neon pink dress and suddenly felt very exposed. Charlotte didn't look at the cameras. She didn't smile or wave. She placed a hand lightly on Arthur's arm. Arthur, the man who looked like he could break a neck with his thumb, leaned in and whispered something to her. She nodded a microscopic movement. The head of the Met's security, a burly man named Henderson, who Richard had tipped $1,000 to earlier that evening, stormed down the stairs. "Ma'am, you can't be here," Henderson barked, though he slowed down as he got closer to Arthur. "This is a private event, invitation only, and this vehicle needs to move immediately." Richard watched a cruel smirk forming. Good. Throw her out. Humiliate her. Arthur didn't speak to Henderson. He simply reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, leather-bound wallet. He flipped it open. It wasn't a ticket. It was a badge. Henderson froze. He looked at the badge, then up at Arthur, then at the car. The color washed out of Henderson's face. He stepped back, bowing his head nervously. "My apologies," Henderson stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't realize the envoy was present. Please, go right ahead." Henderson gestured to his team, who immediately formed a human wall, blocking the paparazzi from getting too close to Charlotte, creating a private tunnel for her to walk up the stairs. Richard stood, paralyzed. While what envoy, Charlotte, began to ascend the stairs. As she passed the roped-off area where Richard and Tiffany stood, she slowed. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Richard's. There was no hate in them, no sadness, just a terrifying glacial indifference. It was the look a human gives to a bug before stepping on it, not out of malice, but because the bug is simply in the way. She didn't speak. She just turned back to the stairs and continued her ascent, the train of her velvet gown gliding over the wet red carpet like oil on water. "Richard," Tiffany tugged his arm. "Richard, you're hurting me." Richard realized he was gripping her arm hard enough to leave bruises. He let go, his breathing shallow. "She rented it," Richard muttered, trying to convince himself. "She blew the whole settlement on a rental and an actor to play chauffeur. It's a stunt, a desperate, pathetic stunt." But as he watched the doors of the Met close behind her, he knew it wasn't a stunt. The air had changed. The temperature in the room had dropped. And for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling felt small. Inside the Metropolitan Museum, the Great Hall was transformed into a cavern of soft light and towering floral arrangements. A string quartet played Debussy in the corner, the music floating over the dull roar of gossip and clinking crystal. Richard entered with Tiffany, his composure hastily reassembled. He handed his coat to a check-in attendant and immediately scanned the room. The hierarchy of New York society was physical. The B-listers and social climbers hovered near the bar. The A-listers and politicians held court in the center. But the true power, the old money, the kingmakers usually occupied the upper balcony or the corners observing. Richard steered Tiffany toward the center. He needed to be seen. He needed to dominate the narrative before Charlotte's entrance caused too many whispers. "Get a drink," he told Tiffany, thrusting a glass of champagne into her hand. "And try not to look at your phone." He spotted Alexander Croft again. The banker was standing near the Temple of Dendor exhibit, swirling a scotch. Richard made a beeline for him. "Alexander," Richard boomed, extending a hand. "I've been trying to reach your office. We need to finalize the bridge loan for London. The permits are all cleared." Alexander Croft was a man of 60, with silver hair and eyes that had seen market crashes and recovered from them without blinking. He looked at Richard's outstretched hand, then took a slow sip of his drink. He didn't shake it. "Richard," Croft said coolly, "I'm afraid the London financing is on hold." Richard froze his hand, dropping. "On hold? What do you mean? We have a verbal agreement." "Risk assessment," Croft said vaguely. "New information has come to light regarding the environmental impact reports. The board is nervous." "That's ridiculous," Richard snapped, his voice rising. "Those reports are ironclad." "Are they?" Croft's eyes drifted past Richard's shoulder. "You might want to ask her." Richard turned. Charlotte was standing 20 feet away in front of an ancient Egyptian sandstone relief. She wasn't alone. Surrounding her was a phalanx of people Richard could never get a meeting with. There was the French ambassador. There was Julianne Moore. And there, leaning in close to hear what Charlotte was saying, was the matriarch of the Astor family, a woman who hadn't attended a public event in 5 years. Charlotte held a glass of water, no alcohol. She was speaking, her posture perfect, her hands moving expressively. The group around her was laughing softly, leaning in, drawn to her gravity. She wasn't a pariah. She was the sun. Richard felt a surge of irrational fury. He grabbed Tiffany's hand and marched toward the group, ignoring Tiffany's protest as her heel caught on the stone floor. "Charlotte!" Richard announced, breaking the circle. The laughter died instantly. The French ambassador looked at Richard with mild annoyance. Charlotte turned slowly. Up close, without the harsh glare of the paparazzi flashes, she looked even more striking. Her skin was luminous, and there was something else, a sharpness to her features that Richard hadn't seen in years. The softness of the corporate wife was gone. "Richard," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, and completely devoid of warmth. "And Tiffany, is it?" Tiffany bristled. "It's Tiffany." "Lovely dress," Charlotte said. "Very spirited." The Astor matriarch stifled a chuckle. "Cut the act, Charlotte." Richard sneered, his voice tight. "Who got you in? Which one of your old charity friends took pity on you?" He looked around the circle, trying to assert dominance. "I hope you all know she's not on the committee anymore. She has no standing here." The silence that followed was excruciating. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment for Charlotte. It was the silence of embarrassment for Richard. The French ambassador took a sip of wine. "Actually, Monsieur Sterling, Madame Vanderbilt, is here as the guest of honor for the European delegation." Richard blinked. "Vanderbilt. Her name is Sterling, and she's not a diplomat. My name," Charlotte interjected softly, "is whatever I choose it to be. And as for my standing," she took a step closer to Richard. She smelled of rain and tuberose. "You spent 15 years thinking you were the one holding the pen, Richard. You thought I was just the paper you wrote your success on. But you forgot something. Paper can burn. You're drunk." Richard scoffed, though he noticed her glass was clear water. "Go home to your apartment in Queens, Charlotte. You're embarrassing yourself." "Queens is quite grounding," Charlotte said. "It gives one time to think, time to organize. Paperwork." She let the word hang in the air. "Paperwork." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What paperwork?" "The Chimera files," she whispered loud enough only for him and Croft, who had drifted closer to hear. "The original soil samples, the emails to Councillor Evans, the bribes masked as consulting fees. It's amazing what one finds when one packs their own boxes." Richard felt the blood leave his extremities. You signed a non-disclosure." "I signed a non-disclosure regarding Sterling Global Proprietary Secrets," Charlotte corrected, her voice razor sharp. "I did not sign a non-disclosure regarding criminal activity. That, Richard, is a civic duty." She smiled, then a small, terrifying smile. "But don't worry, I haven't released them to the press." Richard let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Good. Smart. We can settle this. I can increase the alimony. Charlotte laughed. It was a genuine, dark laugh. Oh, Richard, you still think this is about money? I don't want your money. I haven't given the files to the press because the press is too slow. She gestured toward the entrance of the great hall. I gave them to him. Richard turned, walking through the main doors, flanked by Arthur and two other men in suits that cost more than Richard's house, was an elderly man in a wheelchair. He was frail, hooked up to a portable oxygen tank, but his eyes were bright blue and sharp as diamonds. It was Henri Valois, the patriarch of the Valois-Bourgogne banking empire, the man who controlled half the debt in Europe, the man whose bank currently held the mortgage on Richard's skyscrapers. Richard's knees actually buckled. He grabbed a waiter's tray to steady himself. You know, Charlotte said, leaning into Richard's ear, Henry was my grandmother's dearest friend. They spent summers together in Lake Como before the war. He was heartbroken when I married you. He thought you were common, but I told him you had potential. She stepped back, looking at Richard with pity. He's very disappointed to hear how you treated his goddaughter. And Henri, well, he takes these things very personally. Henri Valois' wheelchair stopped 10 feet away. The old man looked at Richard. He didn't speak. He simply raised one trembling finger and pointed at him, then made a slashing motion across his throat. It wasn't a threat of violence. In the world of high finance, it was something far worse. It was a liquidation order. Alexander Croft, seeing the gesture, immediately stepped back from Richard. Richard, Croft said loudly, I think it's best if we cancel that meeting next week. Sovereign Bank is pulling out. Wait, Richard cried, reaching out. Alexander, please, it's a misunderstanding. But the crowd was already turning their backs. The circle closed around Charlotte and Henri Valois, shutting Richard out. He stood there in the middle of the Met Gala, holding a warm glass of champagne, realizing that the ceiling wasn't falling, the floor was opening up, and Charlotte was the one pulling the lever. The morning after the Met Gala, Richard Sterling woke up in his Fifth Avenue penthouse, but the silence that greeted him wasn't the peaceful quiet of luxury. It was the suffocating silence of a tomb. He reached for his phone on the nightstand. Usually by 8 a.m., his screen would be a chaotic stream of notifications, market updates, sycophantic texts from board members, confirmations for lunch at Le Bernardin. Today there were only 3 notifications. One was a Google alert for his own name. The second was a voicemail from Preston Calloway, his attorney. The third was a text from Tiffany. He opened the text first. Richard, I'm going to my mum's for a few days. The paparazzi outside are too intense. Don't call me. Richard scoffed, tossing the phone onto the duvet. Coward. She was happy to drink his champagne when the cameras were flashing, but the moment the temperature dropped, she fled. He rolled out of bed, his head pounding from the whiskey he had consumed after returning home in a rage. He walked into the living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park, but his eyes were drawn to the coffee table. The morning editions of the papers were spread out, delivered by his housekeeper, Rosa. The headlines were not about his business prowess. The New York Post screamed, "The X-Factor Sterling scorned as Vanderbilt heiress steals the show." The Wall Street Journal, usually, his safe harbor, had a smaller, more devastating sidebar, Sovereign Bank. Pauses, Sterling lending amidst regulatory rumors. Rumors, Richard muttered, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. His hand shook slightly. Just rumors. I can fix this. He showered, dressed in his armor, a charcoal pinstripe suit, and called for his driver. The line rang and rang. Finally, a dispatcher picked up. "Mr. Sterling." The voice was awkward. "We've been instructed by the leasing company to suspend service. The account is 60 days past due." "Past due? I'm a billionaire!" Richard screamed. "It's a clerical error. Send the car." "I'm sorry, sir. The vehicle has been recalled." Richard slammed the phone down. He had to take an Uber to his own skyscraper. When he arrived at Sterling Global, the atmosphere was funereal. The receptionists didn't look up. Junior analysts huddled in corners whispering. As he marched toward his office, he saw Preston Calloway waiting by his door. Preston looked like he hadn't slept. "Inside," Preston said, ushering Richard into his own office and closing the blinds. "What is going on, Preston?" Richard demanded, loosening his tie. "Why is the car service suspended? Why is Tiffany ghosting me?" Preston placed a thick file on the desk. "It's the Valois Group, Richard. They didn't just pull the funding for the London project. They bought your debt." Richard froze. "What?" "The bridge loans you took out last year to cover the expansion, the ones held by Deutsche Bank and J.P. Morgan Valois Bourgogne, bought them all up this morning at a premium. They now hold 80% of your personal and corporate debt. So I'll pay them interest. What's the problem?" "The problem," Preston said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "is the accelerator clause. It's a standard clause in high-risk loans, but usually banks never trigger it unless there's a default. But because of the morality and reputational risk provision in your contract, the one you signed without reading the fine print, they have declared you a high-risk liability." Richard sat down heavily in his leather chair. "English, Preston?" "They've called in the loans, Richard. All of them. Immediately. You owe them $400 million. By close of business, Friday." Richard laughed. It was a dry, hysterical sound. "I don't have $400 million liquid. It's all tied up in stock and real estate." "Exactly," Preston said grimly. "And since the rumor of the environmental fraud leaked, thanks to whoever spoke to the Times this morning, Sterling Global stock has dropped 14% since the opening bell. If you sell assets now, you're selling at a loss. You'll be bankrupt." Richard stared at the wall. He saw Charlotte's face from the night before. Paperwork, she had said. It's amazing what one finds. She hadn't just found the dirt. She had handed the dirt to the executioner, and then handed the executioner the deed to Richard's house. "Get Charlotte on the phone," Richard rasped. "She won't take your call," Preston said. "Then find her. Where is she?" "That apartment in Queens." "She checked out this morning," Preston said. "The landlady said she was picked up by a private helicopter. She's gone, Richard." Richard stood up and walked to the window. He looked down at the ants crawling on the pavement 40 stories below. He realized with a jolt of terror that he wasn't the giant looking down anymore. He was just a man on a ledge. At 3:00 p.m. his secretary, a woman named Janice, who had been with him for 12 years, walked in. She placed her badge on his desk. "Janice, what is this?" "I'm resigning, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've been offered a position elsewhere." "Where? Who would hire you?" "You're 50 years old," Richard sneered, lashing out. Janice straightened her spine. "The Vanderbilt Foundation, they're opening a new office. The benefits are substantial, and the work environment is respectful." She turned and walked out. Richard was left alone in the silent office. The sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. He realized then that Charlotte hadn't just taken his money. She was taking his people. She was stripping the flesh from the bone of his life piece by piece. Friday arrived with the weight of a guillotine blade. The emergency board meeting of Sterling Global was scheduled for 10 a.m. Richard had spent the last 3 days frantically calling every favor he was owed. Senators' hedge fund managers, old college drinking buddies, everyone gave him the same answer, voicemail. He walked into the boardroom, the same room where he had divorced Charlotte less than a month ago. The symmetry was cruel. The board of directors sat around the long mahogany table. 12 men and women who Richard had hand-picked, people he had made rich. They refused to meet his eyes. "Let's get this over with," Richard said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "We have a liquidity issue. I'm proposing a restructuring of the Asia assets to pay off the Valois debt. It's a temporary setback." "We're not restructuring Richard," said Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the board. Marcus was Richard's mentor, a man who had taught him everything about ruthless business. "Excuse me," Richard bristled. "We received a tender offer this morning," Marcus said, sliding a document across the table. "A hostile takeover bid. It's an all-cash offer for 51% of the company, plus the assumption of all debt." "We reject it." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "I am the CEO. I founded this company." "Actually," Marcus said quietly, "you own 20% of the voting shares. The other shareholders have already signaled their intent to sell. The stock is in free fall, Richard. This offer is the only thing saving us from Chapter 11 bankruptcy." "Who is the buyer?" Richard demanded. "Is it BlackRock Vanguard?" The double doors at the end of the boardroom opened. The room went silent. Walking in wasn't a team of lawyers. It was just Charlotte. She wore a white suit today, sharp, architectural, immaculate. She didn't look like a vengeful ex-wife. She looked like a CEO. Flanking her was Arthur carrying a briefcase, and Henri Valois' personal attorney, a French shark named Monsieur Renard. "Hello, Richard," Charlotte said pleasantly. She walked to the opposite end of the table, the foot of the table, and stood there. But the energy in the room shifted. Suddenly the foot of the table became the head. "You," Richard whispered, "you don't have this kind of money. The settlement was 500,000. "The settlement was pocket money," Charlotte said. She placed her hands on the leather chair. "The buyer is the Grand Duchy Trust of Valois-Bourgogne, acting on behalf of the Vanderbilt estate." She looked around the table at the board members. "Gentlemen, ladies, you have the offer. It is contingent on one condition." "Anything," Marcus Thorne said quickly. "What is the condition?" Charlotte pointed a manicured finger at Richard. "Immediate resignation of the CEO for cause. No golden parachute, no stock options, no severance." "You can't do that," Richard screamed, standing up. "I built this. This is mine. You built it on fraud," Charlotte said, her voice hardening into steel. She signaled Arthur, who opened the briefcase and placed a stack of files on the table. "These are the Chimera environmental reports, Richard. The real ones. The ones you tried to bury. If I release these to the SEC, the company isn't just bankrupt. It's a crime scene. You go to prison." The board members gasped, reaching for the files. Marcus Thorne flipped through the pages, his face turning pale. "He falsified the toxicity levels," Marcus muttered. "My God, we'd be liable for billions." Charlotte looked at Richard. "The offer stands. You walk away with nothing, and the company survives under new management. Or you fight the files go public, you go to jail, and the company burns to the ground. Your choice." Richard looked at the faces of his friends on the board. He saw no loyalty. He saw only self-preservation. "Vote," Marcus Thorne said hoarsely. "All in favor of accepting the acquisition and demanding Mr. Sterling's resignation." 12 hands went up. Immediate. Unanimous. Richard felt a physical blow to his chest. It was over. 15 years of climbing, scratching, clawing his way to the top, evaporated in 5 minutes. "Please remove Mr. Sterling from the premises," Marcus said, not looking at him. 2 security guards, men Richard didn't recognize, likely brought in by the new owners, stepped forward. "I can walk," Richard spat. He grabbed his jacket. He walked toward the door, passing Charlotte. He stopped. He wanted to scream at her, to hit her, to beg her. But all he could do was whisper. "Why?" he asked. "Why destroy me? I gave you a life." Charlotte looked at him, and for the first time her mask slipped. He saw a flicker of the woman who had once loved him. "You didn't give me a life, Richard. You consumed mine," she said softly. "You thought I was a decoration. You forgot that the decoration is often the only thing holding the load-bearing wall together." She leaned in closer. "And just so you know, Tiffany called me 3 days ago. She wanted to know if I needed a witness for the environmental fraud. She traded her testimony for a modeling contract with a French agency owned by the Valois Group." Richard's mouth fell open. She worked for you." "She works for the winner," Charlotte said. "Goodbye, Richard." Richard stumbled out into the hallway. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into hell. When he walked out of the building carrying nothing but his jacket, he expected his car. It wasn't there. He stood on the curb, the wind whipping his hair. It started to rain. He reached into his pocket for his phone to call an Uber, but the screen was black. His company phone had been remotely wiped and deactivated. He looked up at the skyscraper, the glass monolith reflecting the grey sky. He saw the workers already on a ladder, removing the bronze letters of Sterling Global from the facade. A bus pulled up to the curb. It was crowded, smelling of wet wool and exhaustion. Richard Sterling, former billionaire, patted his pockets. He had no cash. He had no cards. He started walking. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away from the building that used to be his name. 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline looked exactly the same. Yet for Richard Sterling it was a foreign country he could no longer enter. The headquarters of what was formerly Sterling Global had undergone a subtle but total transformation. The garish chrome lettering was gone, replaced by tasteful understated bronze plaques reading Vanderbilt and Valois Holdings. The aggressive boiler room culture of the trading floor had been dismantled, replaced by a strategy focused on sustainable growth and ethical investment. The stock price hadn't just recovered, it had doubled. Charlotte sat in the corner office, Richard's old office, but the space was unrecognizable. The heavy, intimidating leather furniture was gone, replaced by cream linen and mid-century modern pieces. The blinds were open, letting the light flood in. She was reviewing the quarterly reports with Marcus Thorne, who had managed to keep his job by the skin of his teeth, and a very grovelling apology. "The London project is back on track," Marcus said, his tone respectful, bordering on reverent. "Properly this time. The Community Council approved the new environmental plan. We're projected to break ground in spring." "Good," Charlotte said, signing the document. Signing. She used a simple ballpoint pen, not a gold Mont Blanc. "And the outreach program, fully funded. The Sterling Scholarship has been renamed the Alice Vanderbilt Grant for the Arts." Charlotte smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Marcus. That will be all." As Marcus left, Charlotte swiveled her chair to look out the window. She didn't feel triumph in the way she thought she would. She didn't feel the manic high that Richard used to chase. She felt peace. She had reclaimed her name, her history, and her dignity. She had proven that soft power was still power, perhaps the most durable kind. Miles away across the river, in a cramped office park in New Jersey, Richard Sterling adjusted his headset. "I understand your hesitation." "Mr. Henderson," Richard said into the phone, his voice straining to maintain that old, confident boom. "But this is a ground-floor opportunity in commercial solar. The returns are—" Click. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone screen. "Idiot," he muttered. He sat in a cubicle. Not a corner office. A grey fabric-walled cubicle that smelled of microwaved tuna from the break room. After the collapse of Sterling Global and the SEC investigation that followed, Richard avoided prison only by pleading ignorance and paying a massive fine that wiped out his remaining liquid assets. He was blacklisted from every board in New York. His friends had deleted his number. He was currently working as a senior sales associate for a mid-tier energy firm. He drove a leased Honda Accord. It was lunchtime. Richard walked to the break room and poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. The communal TV on the wall was tuned to CNBC. "Turn that up," a younger colleague said, leaning in. "They're interviewing the Woman of the Year." Richard froze. He looked up at the screen. There she was. Charlotte. She was sitting on a stage wearing a structured emerald green suit, looking regal. The chyron beneath her read, Charlotte Vanderbilt. COO Vanderbilt and Valois. The interviewer asked, "Ms. Vanderbilt, your turnaround of the company has been nothing short of miraculous. You took a firm drowning in debt and scandal and made it a market leader. What was your secret?" Charlotte looked directly into the camera. For a second, Richard felt like she was looking right through the TV screen into his soul. "I learned that value isn't just about the bottom line," Charlotte said smoothly. "My predecessor. He believed that you could build a legacy on transactions. He thought people were disposable assets. But I believe that relationships are the only true currency. When you lose your integrity, you are already bankrupt no matter what the bank account says." The break room went quiet. "She's sharp," Richard's colleague said, taking a bite of a sandwich. "And hot. I heard her ex-husband was a total psycho who tried to stiff her. Guy lost everything. Imagine fumbling a woman like that." Richard felt the bile rise in his throat. He put his coffee down, his hand trembling. "Yeah," he whispered. "Imagine." He walked out of the office building, needing air. He stood in the parking lot, the wind whipping his tie, a cheap polyester blend he'd bought at an outlet. As he stood there, a car pulled into the lot. It was out of place among the sedans and pickup trucks. It was a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, two-tone silver and charcoal. Richard's heart stopped. She's here. Why would she be here? He straightened his jacket, a desperate hope flaring in his chest. Maybe she missed him. Maybe she realized she needed his killer instinct. Maybe she was here to offer him a consulting gig, a way back in. The car stopped. The driver's door opened. Arthur stepped out. He looked exactly the same, granite-faced, immaculate uniform. He walked toward the building entrance carrying a small envelope. Richard stepped into his path. "Arthur!" He called out, his voice cracking. Arthur stopped. He looked at Richard. There was no recognition in his eyes, no respect. He looked at Richard the way one looks at a traffic cone. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said flatly. Is she in the car?" Richard asked, craning his neck to look at the tinted windows. "Madame Vanderbilt is in Paris, attending the climate summit," Arthur said. "I am here on an errand for the estate. We are purchasing this industrial park to convert it into a green energy incubator." Richard blinked. "She's buying the building, my building." "She is buying the block, sir." Arthur checked his watch. "If you'll excuse me." He stepped around Richard as if he were a puddle and continued toward the entrance. Richard stood alone in the parking lot. He looked at the Rolls-Royce. It sat there, a silent, gleaming monument to the life he had thrown away because he thought he could do better. He thought Charlotte was the weight holding him down. He realized now, standing in the cold New Jersey wind, that she was the only thing that had ever made him fly. He turned back to his Honda. He had calls to make. He had a quota to hit. The king was dead. Long live the queen. And that is how Charlotte Vanderbilt didn't just win the divorce. She won the war. Richard Sterling spent his life counting pennies, never realizing that the true wealth was sitting right across the dinner table from him. He treated people like stepping stones, and in the end, he tripped on his own ego. It's a powerful reminder that in the game of life, the person who holds the loudest microphone isn't always the one with the most power. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who sits quietly, takes notes, and waits for the perfect moment to open the door. What do you think? Did Richard deserve to lose everything, or was Charlotte's revenge too harsh? I want to hear your opinion in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served ice cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We have a crazy tale coming up next week about a runaway bride and a billionaire's secret will, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching.
Teresa's in our special shoes to walk on the snow. Yeah, I have my snow sneakers. Well, my snow shoes on as of right now. Julie is saying I definitely need a donut and a hot chocolate. Yeah, exactly. I do need one, Julia. And I'm definitely gonna go get one as well later on. But hey Julia, thank you so much for the super chat. Appreciate it,